The topic is higher education at the 21st century, and we're fortunate again to have with us a sociologist from Tennessee State University, Dr. EKSanford. And of course, Dr. Sanford, let me reintroduce this idea that we've talked about, and what I'd like for you to do during this final segment is sort of give us some directions in terms of making higher education accessible to people during the 21st century. What are some of the things that we have to do, and why is it necessary that we do these things? I guess we might.
Okay. And that's a very important question for us to be able to deal with. I think a number of possibilities are there. One, I think we have to be very conscious as a nation, as different ethnic groups, even the dominant group, that the importance of higher education in the 21st century, and that we all need it because we are living in this telecommunications society in comparison to when we lived in a more rural type of society. So it's very important. Now there's a little twist to it. I feel, particularly for the African American community, we have to be very parent involved with preparing our students in elementary school, junior high school, and high school for that next level of entering into an institution of higher education. And that preparation has to be very student-parent oriented, to the point where the parent is playing the role as teacher and being very involved with that student, because grades are very important. Doing well on test scores for SAT, ACTs to go in is very important. And what we find is that there's this gap still this last year between European Americans and African Americans, so the question becomes why. And I think there's this legacy that has always been, if I may just very quickly give a metaphor of a track meet. And if you have a relay going on, if you have someone running 3 laps and then let the other group start, and they are 3/4 of the way finished, and then at the end you are asking the question, well, why didn't you come in first place? And so this has been the legacy of the Holocaust of African enslavement for such a long period of time. And so with that familiarity, we now have to be very parent, teacher oriented towards students and get them ready with certain type of remedial types of education, using our institutions of the church and religion to help prepare students for this 21st century higher education. Any avenue possible. Now, we have to be very clear about some of the goals that are important. Coming out of high school, one must know, entering, that there's this goal of critical thinking, of listening, of writing, of reading, of being very sensitive to cultural diversity, some of the issues that you've already raised today, understanding numbers, understanding local, national, regional, and now global type of history is very important. When you think of Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his classic piece entitled The Miseducation of the Negro, was important at that time when he wrote it, and it's just as important today, that we must, within this African-American, say, parent-teacher relationship, understand that legacy that we knew in the past, and understand it, because our school system might give us a certain amount of information, but now it's going to be on us to learn both levels. That's what Dr. Du Bois talks about when he talks about the two-ness in his classic piece entitled The Soul of Black Folks. We have to be both American and African American. So when you think about Dr. L. Adid's classic piece at Tennessee State University and his contribution for the African American Studies Department, that is there as an infrastructure, if you will, to help students to recapture this legacy of this history and become whole people again as they enter into an institution of higher learning. So it's very important.
You know, you mentioned the fact of the parent-student kind of involvement.
Yes.
But now, what would happen to those young people? What about those young people who really don't have that kind of parental involvement? And in so many instances, what about the parents themselves who might not be as familiar with the kind of thing that you're talking about? I mean, what do we do in terms of trying to reach this particular group of young people?
That's why I mentioned our churches. I think churches and programs like yours will hopefully better educate. What we are finding in the data is that regardless of social class, in many instances within the African American community, we still have this gap between African Americans and European Americans within these test scores. So while we have moved up economically, occupationally, and even educationally within our parents, we are still not taking that time that is needed with our children to place that emphasis on reading, that emphasis on spending time learning math. So it's this whole notion of that socialization process in learning that is needed there. And I would strongly recommend that we give some very strong thought to that. It's just important today as we are talking about it, as it will be at the end of the 21st century to do the same types of things. Now, that said, the African American community has always valued education. You know, from an earlier time period when we were enslaved, that mother and father always felt that next generation would be better. So that's always been a strong value. But now we are dealing with in this telecommunications society, a point in time where we have to be very conscious of that we need to be very in tune as far as being a teacher and teachers being teachers and helping students to learn these new goals and objectives as far as higher education is concerned. So I hope that our churches can be very important. You know, talk shows like this to have educators to come in and to talk about it. Hopefully the churches can come up with innovative programs to help even pre-kindergartners start to learn about this all the way up to college, and they're ready and they're prepared.
You know, one of the great controversies, I think, Doctor, is we've got about 4 minutes, and I certainly want to see if we can